The Guadalupe River did not know justice. In the season of floods, it only knew a deep, muscular hunger. Swallowing red clay banks and spitting brown foam, it was a thing of raw power, a churning sermon of mud and motion that drowned out all other sounds in San Marcos. Texas. Even the silence from the church bell tower seemed to bend to the river's roar. The bell had not rung in 7 months. Not since Miguel Morales had missed his footing on the scaffolding of that same tower and fallen, leaving a silence in the town and a widow in his small, neat house. His widow, Isabella Morales, stood where the path dissolved into the greedy water's edge. She was 23 years old, with hair the color of night and eyes that held the quiet grief of a sky after a storm. It was her beauty. The town whispered. That was the problem. It was a beauty that did not look like it belonged to a widow. It was a flame that drew moths and made other, dimmer lights feel inadequate. She wore a dress of simple blue cotton, the color of a jaybird's wing, a detail that would later be recalled with a venomous precision. She had only come to the river to feel a force of nature greater than the small, persistent cruelties of the town. She had not expected to find them waiting for her here. There were 5 of them. They moved not like individual women, but like a single creature with 5 heads, their calico dresses blending into a mass of judgmental fabric. Martha Caldwell was at their head. As the mayor's wife, she considered the moral temperature of San Marcos her personal responsibility, a thing to be measured and, when necessary, corrected with a firm hand. Her face was a hard biscuit of piety. With her were Elizabeth, Mary, Anne, and Susan, wives of other men of standing, their expressions reflecting Martha's own severe righteousness. "Isabella," Martha said, her voice cutting through the river's noise. It was not a greeting. It was an indictment. Isabella turned, her hand flying to her throat. She had not heard them approach over the sucking sound of the mud. "Martha! Ladies, we have come to speak with you about your soul," Martha announced, stepping closer. The others fanned out, a deliberate and practiced maneuver that cut off any path of retreat. "The town is troubled. A woman in your position, carrying on with such brightness." She gestured vaguely at the blue dress, as if it were a garish sin. "I do not understand," Isabella said, her voice small but steady. She had been surviving on a diet of such coded accusations for months. She understood them perfectly. "Your husband is barely cold in the ground," Elizabeth added, her words sharp pebbles, "and you walk about as if you were free. It is an offense to God and to us, your sisters in Christ." "My mourning is my own," Isabella replied, taking a step back, her heels sinking into the soft, wet earth. "It lives in my heart, not on my sleeve." Martha Caldwell smiled, a thin, unpleasant crack in her face. "The heart can be a deceptive thing. It needs purification. The Lord sent this flood to wash the land of its filth. We believe it can do the same for a wayward soul." The air grew thick and heavy. Isabella looked from one stony face to the next, seeing the same cold fire in every pair of eyes. It was envy, pure and simple, dressed up in the robes of Scripture. They envied her youth, the turn of her head, the way their husbands' eyes would sometimes follow her from the saloon porch. Even in her grief, they had taken that envy and let it curdle into something they could call holy. "This is not right," Isabella whispered, a plea and a statement of fact. "The river will make it right," Martha declared, and then they moved. It was not a shove so much as a collective surge, a wall of determined flesh and bone. Hands grabbed at her arms, her shoulders. Isabella cried out, a sharp, bird-like sound that was swallowed by the Guadalupe. She struggled, but she was 1 against 5, and their strength was the strength of absolute conviction. They were not women pushing another woman. They were agents of a divine, if self-appointed, will. They pushed her to the crumbling edge of the bank. For a heart-stopping second, she balanced on the precipice. the brown water churning below her. Then, with a final, unified effort, she was gone, swallowed by the cold, silty water. The shock of the cold was a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs. The current was a living thing, a predator. It grabbed her, spun her, dragged her down into a world of churning brown and suffocating silence. Her blue dress billowed around her like a shroud. She fought, kicking toward a sun she could no longer see, her lungs screaming for air. She surfaced, gasping, only to be pulled under again. The faces on the bank were a blur of triumphant righteousness. Then they too disappeared, and there was only the river. 3 miles downriver, where the flood had turned his lower pasture into a shallow lake. Samuel Carter was checking the strain on his fence posts. At 50 years old, Samuel was a man carved from the West itself. His face was a map of sun and wind. His hands were thick and calloused, and his silence was as vast as the Texas sky. He had bought this land and built his adobe house with his own 2 hands, creating a small kingdom of solitude. He wanted nothing from San Marcos, and in return, he asked only that it leave him be. He had heard the shout, a faint cry torn apart by the wind. He straightened up, his eyes scanning the roiling surface of the Guadalupe. For a moment he saw nothing but debris, a tangle of branches, a dead pig turning slowly in an eddy. Then he saw it, a flash of blue, a dark head breaking the surface, a flailing arm, a person. Samuel did not hesitate. He did not weigh the risk or consider the consequences. He saw someone in need, and the moral calculus of his soul was swift and absolute. He ran along the bank, his long legs eating up the muddy ground, keeping pace with the helpless figure in the water. He kicked off his boots, dropped his tool belt, and plunged into the river. The water was a brutal, numbing cold. The current was even stronger than he had anticipated, a relentless force pulling him toward the Gulf of Mexico. But Samuel was strong, his muscles seasoned by decades of hard labor. He fought the river, angling himself downstream, his eyes locked on the spot where he had last seen the blue dress. He found her just as she was going under for what might have been the last time. He grabbed a handful of her dark, wet hair, then worked an arm under her chest and began the long, punishing battle back to the shore. He hauled her onto the muddy bank, his chest heaving. She was limp, unmoving, her face a pale, waxy white. He did not recognize her at first. He only saw a woman, half drowned and close to death. He turned her on her side, and a gush of river water poured from her mouth. She gave a racking cough, a shudder that ran through her whole body, and then lay still, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. He looked at her face then, pushing the wet hair away from her forehead, and he knew who she was. The widow Morales. He had seen her in town, always from a distance. He knew her husband had died. He knew the whispers that followed her like stray dogs. And he knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, that she had not fallen into the river by accident. He looked back toward San Marcos, 3 miles of mud and mesquite away. He could take her there, to the doctor, or to the priest, Father Donovan, but that would be returning her to the wolves. He looked down at her fragile, unconscious form. The town had passed its verdict. He was passing his. With a grunt, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a bird with wet feathers. He began the long walk back to his adobe house, his bare feet sinking into the mud. He did not look back. The first night in his house was a contest of sounds. Outside, the wind howled through the branches of the mesquite trees, a lonely and mournful sound. Inside, the only noises were the crackling of the fire he had built in the hearth and the broken, watery rhythm of Isabella's breathing. He had stripped off her soaked blue dress, a practical necessity that felt like a violation, and had wrapped her in 2 of his thickest wool blankets. He had placed her on a cot near the fire, and now he sat in his worn armchair, a shotgun across his lap, watching her. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, He watched the way the firelight played across her pale skin. He was not a man given to flights of fancy, but he could not help but think she looked like a fallen star, something that did not belong in his rough, quiet world. He was a rancher. He knew life and he knew death. He had seen calves born and horses put down. He knew the look of a creature hovering between two worlds. The widow was there now. He brewed coffee, strong and black, filling the small house with its bitter, earthy scent. He did not know if she would wake up, but if she did, he wanted her to smell something other than the river. Meanwhile, in San Marcos, the first seeds of rumor were being planted in the fertile soil of the town's suspicion. Martha Caldwell and her companions had returned from the river, their faces flushed with the thrill of their righteous act. They did not speak of it directly. They did not have to. A word to a husband over dinner. A meaningful glance exchanged over a fence with a neighbor. A hushed conversation in the aisles of the general store. The widow Morales had been near the river. She had been acting strangely. Some said she had thrown herself in, overcome with guilt and grief. Others, with a knowing look, suggested a more sinister possibility. A fall, perhaps an accident. The river was high, after all. The story shifted and grew with each telling, blooming like a patch of poison ivy in the Texas heat. The men in the saloon lowered their voices when Mayor Caldwell walked in, his face drawn and tight. He knew his wife, and he knew her convictions, and a cold dread was beginning to settle in his stomach. The town was a tinderbox of gossip and resentment, and someone had just struck a match. The question was not if it would burn, but what would be left when the fire went out. Back in the adobe house, 3 miles and a world away. Samuel Carter added another log to the fire. The woman on the cot stirred, a low moan escaping her lips. He leaned forward, his weathered face tense. For the first time in many years, the silence of his life had been broken, and he knew, with the grim certainty of a man who had seen his share of storms, that it would never be the same. The Guadalupe River had brought her to his door, but it was the town he would have to fight. Isabella woke to the smell of coffee and wood smoke. For a moment, she was adrift, untethered from memory, floating in a warm, dark space. Then the river came rushing back, a cold and violent memory that made her gasp. Her eyes flew open. She was not in her own small house. She was lying on a cot in a room made of thick, plastered earth, the ceiling heavy with dark wooden beams. A fire danced in a large stone hearth, throwing a gentle, flickering light on the simple, masculine furnishings: a sturdy table, 2 chairs, a shelf of preserved goods in glass jars, and a long rifle resting on pegs by the door. A man sat in one of the chairs, his back to her, staring into the flames. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the wool blankets that covered her. It was a widow's fear, the deep, primal terror of being vulnerable and alone in the presence of a strange man. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness and a deep, rattling cough forced her back down. The movement caught his attention. He turned his head slowly, and she saw the weathered landscape of his face, the quiet gravity in his eyes. It was Samuel Carter. She knew him by sight, the recluse who kept to his ranch and bought his supplies in town with the fewest possible words. He rose from his chair, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He was a large man, but he moved with a quiet economy that was not threatening. He walked to the hearth where a tin pot sat warming on the stones. He poured a dark, steaming liquid into a thick ceramic mug. He brought it to her, holding it out. "Coffee," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like stones moving at the bottom of a creek. It was the first word he had spoken to her. She pushed herself up on one elbow, clutching the blankets to her chin. Her hand trembled as she took the mug. The warmth seeped into her fingers, a small, solid comfort in a world that had dissolved into chaos. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a raw, unused thing. "There's a robe," he said, nodding toward a hook by the door where a heavy, dark wool robe hung. "Your dress is by the fire. It's dry now." She looked and saw her blue dress, clean of mud, hanging from a peg on the mantelpiece. The sight of it brought a fresh wave of horror. He had undressed her. The thought sent a hot flush of shame through her, but it was followed by a cooler, more rational understanding. He had saved her life. A wet dress would have killed her. He had done what was necessary. She looked at him again, at his stoic face, and saw no trace of impropriety, only a profound and unsettling neutrality. He was not looking at her as a man looks at a woman, but as a rancher might look at a half-frozen lamb he had brought in from a storm. "Where?" she began, her throat tight. "My place," he answered, before she could finish. 3 miles down from town. He turned back to the fire, taking his seat as if the conversation were concluded. The silence that fell between them was immense, filled only by the crackle of the flames and the sound of her own ragged breathing. She was alive. She was warm. And she was in more danger now than she had been in the river. The Guadalupe could only drown you. The town could do far worse. In San Marcos, the whispers had found their voice. They moved through the general store, passed between the pews before church, and settled over the beers in the saloon. Martha Caldwell had constructed her narrative with the skill of a master weaver. The poor widow Morales, overcome by a grief so deep it had unsettled her mind, had gone to the river's edge. There had been a tragic accident, a slip, a fall, such a pity. Her circle of friends corroborated the story with solemn nods and downcast eyes, their expressions a perfect blend of sorrow and piety. But other threads were being woven into the tapestry of gossip. The widow had not been found. Samuel Carter had not been seen in town. His ranch was between the town and the deeper bends of the river. One story began to feed the other. In the minds of the townspeople, a new and far more scandalous narrative took shape. The men in the saloon discussed it in low voices, their gazes fixed on their glasses. The women spoke of it with wide, knowing eyes, a thrill of righteous indignation adding a spark to their otherwise dull afternoons. The widow and the recluse. It was a story that wrote itself. A tale of sin and solitude that was too delicious to resist. Mayor Caldwell felt the shift in the town's atmosphere like a change in the weather. He saw the looks, heard the sudden silences that fell when he approached. He confronted his wife in the privacy of their parlor. "Martha, what have you done?" he asked, his voice heavy with a weariness that went beyond politics. "I have done the Lord's work," she replied, her chin high, her certainty as unshakable as the stone foundation of their house. "I offered a lost soul a chance at purification. The mayor, a man who understood the mechanics of power but not the fires of zealotry, could only shake his head and retreat into a troubled, helpless silence. The days at the adobe ranch house fell into a slow, quiet rhythm. It was a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land, not by the clocks and calendars of town. Isabella's fear did not vanish, but it receded, pushed back by the steady, demanding pulse of life on the ranch. The first day, she did little more than sleep and drink the broth Samuel left for her. By the second, the strength began to return to her limbs. She rose from the cot and put on her blue dress. It felt strange, a costume from another life. She saw Samuel outside, his back to the house, driving a new post into the soft earth with a heavy mallet. The sound was solid, real. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of something being mended. She went into the small, clean kitchen area. She found the coffee, ground it, and set a fresh pot to brew. It was a small act, but it was hers. When Samuel came in an hour later, his face damp with sweat, the house was filled with the rich aroma. He stopped just inside the door, his eyes flicking to the pot on the stove. Then to her. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the acknowledgement that was needed. A silent contract was drawn between them. He offered her shelter, a roof and a fire. In return, She began to contribute to the life of the house. She cooked simple meals of beans and cornbread. She swept the packed earth floor. She found his mending basket, a jumble of worn shirts and socks, and set to work with a needle and thread. Each stitch was a small act of defiance against the helplessness she had felt in the river. In the town, she was not just a victim. She was a woman who could mend, who could cook, who could create order. One afternoon, while he was out with the cattle, she explored the small patch of earth by the front door. She found a rusty tin containing a handful of dried seeds. She did not know what they were, but she recognized the dormant life within them. Using a stick, she broke the hard soil, planting the seeds in neat rows. She watered them using the bucket from the well. The creak of the pump, a loud but satisfying complaint in the quiet air. She was planting a garden. She was putting down roots, however shallow and temporary, in this strange and quiet soil. Their conversations were sparse, made up of the essential nouns of their shared existence. "Water's low," he would say, and she would know he was heading to the well. "Shirt's fixed," she would reply, leaving a neatly folded garment on his chair. Yet, in the spaces between these few words, a language was developing. It was a language of shared tasks, of mutual respect for the boundaries of their solitude. He never entered the main room when she was dressing or sleeping, and she never went near the small, separate room that was his. The fence he was building around the pasture became a powerful symbol for her. It was a line drawn against the world, a declaration of a safe and protected space. On Sunday, the weight of the town pressed in on them. Samuel did not go to church, had not for years, but the day still felt different. The air was heavier. In San Marcos, Father Donovan stood before his congregation. He was a good man, a man who believed the role of the church was to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. The whispers had reached him, and they had troubled his soul. His sermon was on the parable of the Good Samaritan. He spoke of the man left beaten on the side of the road, and of the priest and the Levite who passed by, too concerned with their own purity to help. He spoke of the Samaritan, the outsider, the one who was despised, who stopped and bound the man's wounds. Who, in this story, is the neighbor, he asked, his voice echoing in the wooden church. It is not the one who shares your blood or your beliefs. It is the one who shows mercy. He looked out at the faces before him. He saw Martha Caldwell in the front pew, her expression hardening into a mask of righteous anger. He saw the other women, their eyes shifting uncomfortably. He saw the men, their gazes dropping to the floorboards. To judge another is to usurp the role of God. He continued, his voice softer now, but no less firm. To spread rumor and innuendo is to poison the well from which we all must drink. Our duty as Christians is simple: to protect the weak, to shelter the homeless, to offer a cup of hot coffee to the one who is cold. The sermon ended. The congregation filed out into the bright Texas sun, the silence between them thick with unspoken accusations. Father Donovan's words had not extinguished the fire. They had merely drawn the battle lines more clearly. Martha Caldwell gathered her flock around her on the church steps, her whispers now laced with a new and sharper venom. The priest, she hissed, had been swayed by a pretty face. The church itself was now complicit in the sin. Back at the ranch, Isabella knew nothing of the sermon. She only knew that the slow, quiet work of the days was beginning to heal something inside her. The trembling in her hands had lessened. The nightmare of the river came less frequently. She watched Samuel from the doorway as he worked on the fence, his movements strong and sure. He was not a man of comforting words, but his actions were a sermon of their own. He had pulled her from the water. He had given her a roof over her head. He had fenced in a small piece of the world and made it safe. For now, it was enough. The fear of returning to town was a cold stone in the pit of her stomach. But here, in the quiet adobe house, under the steady gaze of this silent man, she felt the first tentative flicker of a life being reborn. Martha Caldwell's kitchen was the heart of her home, a place of warmth and the comforting smell of baking bread. But on this afternoon, it was a council of war. The air was not warm, but thick with a simmering heat that had nothing to do with the cast-iron stove. Sunlight, thick with dust motes, slanted through the window, illuminating the 5 women gathered around the heavy oak table. Their sewing baskets sat untouched. This was not a time for mending cloth, but for mending the moral fabric of San Marcos, a task they had appointed to themselves. Father Donovan's sermon had been the spark. It had not shamed them into silence. It had hardened their resolve. To them, the priest's words were not a call for mercy, but a betrayal, a sign that the corruption had spread even to the house of God. Their jealousy, which had once been a private, nagging thing, had now been sanctified. It was no longer a personal resentment of Isabella Morales's youth and beauty. It was a sacred duty to protect their homes, their husbands, and their town from a contagion. He spoke of her, Mary said, her fingers twisting a loose thread on the tablecloth. He called her the one who is cold, the one who needs shelter, as if she were some innocent lamb. "She is a wolf," Martha stated, her voice flat and hard. "And Samuel Carter has opened his door to her. I had Thomas's boy ride out that way yesterday. He saw her, in the yard, plain as day, planting something by the door. Shameless." A collective hiss of indignation went through the room. The abstract rumor was now a concrete fact, a verified scene of domesticity that was an affront to them all. The widow was not just hiding. She was nesting. "What are the men saying?" Anne asked, her gaze flicking nervously toward the kitchen door, as if their husbands might overhear. "They say what men always say," Martha replied with contempt. "Nothing. They look at their boots. They talk about the price of cattle. They are weak. They see a pretty face, and their judgment goes soft. That is why the duty falls to us. We are the keepers of the hearth. We must sweep out the filth that others are too blind to see." She leaned forward, her hands flat on the table, her eyes sweeping over each woman, commanding their loyalty, reinforcing their shared purpose. "He is never gone for long, but he has a far pasture to the west. Sometimes he is gone for hours. We will go this afternoon. We will face her. We will bring this sin out of the blinding sun and into the public square where it belongs." There was a moment of hesitation. It was one thing to push a woman into a river on the deserted banks. It was another to march onto Samuel Carter's land. He was a man who kept to himself, a man whose silence was rumored to hold a capacity for violence that no one was eager to test. "He won't be there," Martha said, sensing their fear. "It will be just us. And her, 5 against 1. The Lord will give us strength." Her certainty was a powerful force. It swept away their doubts, replacing them with a renewed sense of righteous conviction. They were not a mob. They were soldiers of God. They rose from the table, a single organism moving with a single will, and left the warmth of the kitchen for the harsh, unforgiving glare of the Texas sun. The 3-mile walk to the ranch was a pilgrimage of grim determination. The red dust of the road kicked up by their skirts, coating their boots and the hems of their dresses. The sun beat down, and the air was alive with the buzz of insects. They did not speak. Their purpose was set, their arguments made. Now there was only the steady, rhythmic tramp of their feet on the dry earth, a sound like a slow, approaching drumbeat. Isabella was on her knees in the small patch of earth she now thought of as her garden. The seeds she had planted had begun to sprout, tiny green shoots pushing their way through the cracked soil. It was a small miracle, a promise of life in a place that had been barren. The rhythmic work, the feel of the soil under her fingers, had become a kind of prayer, a way of reconnecting with the simple, life-affirming forces of the world. She felt a peace she had not known since before Miguel's death. She saw the dust cloud first, a rising plume on the road from town. She rose to her feet, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart giving a sudden, painful lurch. A rider, perhaps. Samuel had told her he was checking the fence line along the western ridge and would be gone most of the afternoon. She squinted against the sun. and the cloud resolved itself into not one figure, but several, walking with a purpose that seemed aimed directly at the adobe house. Then she saw the distinct shapes of their bonnets, the sway of their long skirts. Her blood ran cold. It was them. Her first instinct was a wild, animal panic. To run, to hide inside the house, bolt the door, and pray they would go away. The memory of their hands on her, of the cold, suffocating water, was a physical thing, a ghost that clawed at her throat. She took a step back toward the door, her hand reaching for the latch. But she stopped. She looked at the solid, unyielding walls of the adobe house. She looked at the new fence posts Samuel had driven into the earth. She thought of the quiet respect he had shown her, the way he had given her space to heal without ever asking for anything in return. This place had become a sanctuary, and she would not let them defile it. Something inside her, a core of strength she did not know she possessed, refused to yield. The girl who had been pushed into the river was not the same woman who stood in this yard. She did not run. Instead, she walked deliberately to the shallow porch, mounted the single wooden step, and turned to face them. She stood straight, her hands clasped before her, waiting. The porch was not just a piece of wood. It was a boundary. It was the line between the wilderness of their hatred and the small civilization of this home. They came to a halt at the edge of the yard, their formation fanning out as it had at the riverbank. The red dust settled around their feet. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whispering through the dry grass. Martha Caldwell stepped forward, her face a mask of grim satisfaction. "So, the lost sheep has found a new shepherd. What do you want?" Martha Isabella's voice was low, but it carried in the still air. It did not tremble. "We have come for you," Martha announced, her voice ringing with authority. "The town of San Marcos will not tolerate this flaunting of decency. You will come back with us. You will confess your sin before the entire congregation." "I have no sin to confess," Isabella said. "Lying is a sin as well," Elizabeth sneered from the side. "Living here, alone with this man, we all know what that means." "You know nothing," Isabella retorted, a spark of anger cutting through her fear. "You see what your own bitter hearts want you to see." "We see the truth," Martha's voice rose, sharp and shrill. "We see a woman who has bewitched a man and brought shame upon us all. We have come to drag the wickedness into the light." She took a step toward the porch. The other four moved with her, a slow, menacing wave of calico and judgment. They were going to lay hands on her again. They were going to drag her from this place of safety and throw her to the wolves. Isabella braced herself, her knuckles white where she gripped her hands together. She would not scream this time. She would not struggle. She would meet their violence with a stillness they could not comprehend. And then he was there. He did not ride up in a cloud of dust. He did not shout a warning. He simply rounded the corner of the barn, his stride long and unhurried. He held a coil of wire in one hand. He stopped, taking in the scene in a single, sweeping glance, the 5 women poised like predators at the foot of his porch, and the one woman standing on it, alone and defiant. His presence changed the air. It was as if a mountain had suddenly risen from the flat Texas plain. He did not look angry. He looked something far more formidable. He looked certain. He walked past the women without a word, his gaze fixed on Isabella. He saw the terror behind her brave facade, and his expression, which was usually a neutral mask, softened for the barest fraction of a second. He stepped up onto the porch and stood beside her. Then he turned to face the delegation in his yard. He placed himself slightly in front of her, a living shield. "This is private land," he said. His voice was not loud, but it had the weight of granite. It was the voice of a man who did not speak often, so when he did, every word counted. Martha Caldwell was momentarily thrown off balance by his sudden appearance, but her fanaticism was a powerful engine. "This is a matter of public morality. Samuel Carter, it concerns the whole town. This woman, "This woman is a guest in my home," he said, cutting her off. He did not look at her. He looked at each of the other 4 women in turn, his gaze steady and unflinching, holding each of them for a silent, uncomfortable moment before moving to the next. They squirmed under his scrutiny, their collective courage beginning to fray. "She is under my protection," Samuel continued, his voice dropping even lower, yet carrying a resonance that seemed to make the very air vibrate. He looked at Martha then, his eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. "She is under my word. This is safe ground." The words hung in the air, simple, direct, and absolute. He had not threatened them. He had not insulted them. He had simply stated a fact as fundamental as the earth beneath their feet. He had given his word. On his land, his word was law. It was a code older and more powerful than their gossip, a creed of masculine honor that their own husbands would have understood, even if they were too weak to practice it. The 5 women stood frozen. They had come to confront a lone, frightened widow. They found themselves facing a principle, embodied in the unmoving form of this quiet, formidable man. Their righteous fire sputtered, starved of the oxygen of an easy victory. Martha's face was a storm of conflicting emotions, rage, humiliation, and a sliver of fear. She had been publicly thwarted. She looked past Samuel to Isabella, and the hatred in her eyes was a raw, physical force. "This is not over," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "You cannot hide from God's judgment behind one man. We will be back, and we will bring our husbands." She turned on her heel and marched away. The other 4 hesitated for a moment, then scurried after her, their unity broken, their crusade a failure. They did not look back. The dust settled again. The sound of their retreating footsteps faded, replaced once more by the lonely sound of the wind. Samuel did not move until they were out of sight. He stood as a sentinel, his broad back to Isabella, guarding the porch, guarding his word. When they were gone, he finally turned. He looked at Isabella. She was trembling now, the adrenaline of the confrontation giving way to a deep, shuddering reaction. He saw the tears welling in her eyes, tears of fear and relief and a profound, bone-deep gratitude. He did not say, "Are you all right?" He did not offer a comforting touch. He simply gave a short, sharp nod. The same gesture he had used when he first saw that she had made coffee. It said everything that needed to be said. "You are safe here. I will not let them harm you." Then he turned, stepped off the porch, and went back to mending his fence. The storm had passed, for now, but they all knew it was gathering strength just over the horizon. The threat Martha Caldwell had left behind was heavier than the coming storm. It settled in the air, a silent, oppressive weight. That afternoon, the sky turned the color of a bruise. The wind, which had been a dry whisper, began to moan, carrying the cold scent of rain. Samuel came back from the fence line, his face grim. He did not look at the road to town, but Isabella knew that was where his thoughts were. "Storm's coming," he said, his voice a low rumble, a cold one. He began securing the homestead, checking the shutters on the main house, moving tools into the barn, his actions efficient and methodical. There was a small cabin set off from the house, a place he had used for storing grain and saddles before the barn was finished. It had a small, efficient stove and a built-in bunk. "The horses will be spooked by the lightning," he said, more to himself than to her. "I'll stay in the barn tonight. Keep them calm." Isabella understood. He was not just tending to his animals. He was standing watch. The barn had a clear view of the road. He would be the first to see anyone approaching. The thought sent a cold shiver through her that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. "There is a stove in the old cabin," she said quietly. "I can make a fire. I will stay there." It was an unspoken agreement. The main house felt too large, too empty. The small cabin was a fortress, a small, defensible space. He gave her a single, sharp nod of approval and went back to his work. as the first drops of rain, hard and cold as pellets of lead, began to fall. Isabella gathered what she needed: a blanket, a lantern, the makings for coffee. She entered the cabin. It smelled of old leather, hay, and dry earth. It was a simple, honest smell. She found the kindling and wood stacked neatly by the small pot-bellied stove. Within minutes, she had a small, hungry fire coaxed to life. The flames pushed back the gloom, casting a warm, dancing light on the rough wooden walls. The rain came in earnest then, a torrential downpour that hammered on the tin roof. The wind shrieked around the corners of the small building. Isabella sat on a low stool, wrapped in a blanket, and watched the fire. Each gust of wind sounded like an approaching rider. Every crackle of the flames was a footstep, Martha's promise. "We will be back, and we will bring our husbands," echoed in her mind, a venomous counterpoint to the storm's fury. She was safe, she told herself. Samuel was in the barn. He was watching, but the fear was a living thing, a cold serpent coiling in her belly. She must have drifted off, lulled into a fitful sleep by the fire's warmth and the relentless drumming of the rain. And in that sleep, the river found her again. She was not on the bank this time. She was in the water, the brown, silt-choked current tumbling her over and over. There was no air, only a suffocating press of cold and mud. She fought, her limbs heavy, useless. She could feel the river's immense, impersonal power, a force that did not hate her, but simply did not care that she existed. She saw the faces of the women, not on the bank, but in the water with her, their features distorted by the current, their mouths open in silent, mocking laughter. She opened her own mouth to scream, but the river rushed in, filling her lungs, her soul, with its cold, dark weight. She woke with a strangled cry, bolting upright on the bunk, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cabin was dark except for the dull red glow of the embers in the stove. The rain was still beating on the roof. She was drenched in a cold sweat. The blanket tangled around her legs. She was shaking, a deep, uncontrollable shudder that started in the core of her being and radiated out to her fingertips. The dream had been so real. She could still feel the mud in her throat, the icy grip of the Guadalupe. The cabin door creaked open. A figure filled the doorway, silhouetted against the gray, stormy dark. She flinched, a small, animal sound of terror escaping her lips. "Easy," a low voice said. It was Samuel. He stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him, plunging the room back into near darkness. He carried a lantern, but he did not light it. He seemed to navigate the small space by instinct. He moved to the stove and, with a few deft movements, added a couple of small logs. The embers caught, and a small flame flickered to life, pushing back the shadows. He had a tin mug in one hand and a small, dry towel in the other. He had come from the barn, from his vigil. His hair was damp, and his rough wool jacket smelled of rain and horses. His hands, she noticed as he set the mug and towel down on a crate, were raw and chapped from the wind and the cold. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not need to. He could see the terror in her eyes, could see the way she trembled. He simply stood there for a moment, a large, solid presence in the small, storm-tossed room, letting her terror subside. The firelight grew stronger, casting his long shadow on the wall. It fell on his hand as he rested it on the back of the stool. In the flickering light, she saw a long, pale scar that ran from his wrist up his forearm, a ghostly white line against his sun-darkened skin. It was an old wound, a relic from a life lived before she had ever known him, a testament to struggles she could not imagine. It spoke of war, perhaps, or of a different kind of flood, a past filled with its own violences. For the first time, she saw him not just as a protector, but as a man who had his own ghosts. Her shaking did not stop. It was a deep, internal ague, the physical echo of the soul's terror. He picked up the dry towel and stepped toward her. She flinched again, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. He stopped. He did not want to frighten her. This man who was as careful with her fear as he would be with a newborn foal. He just wanted to stop the shaking. He took another slow step forward, his movements telegraphing his intent. He was not a man of easy comforts or practiced words. He only knew how to do what needed to be done. And what needed to be done was to ground this terrified woman back to the solid earth, to pull her out of the phantom river that still had its grip on her. He meant no sin yet. In the quiet cabin, his hands found the innocence he longed to protect. He gently laid the towel over her shoulders, then placed his large, calloused hands on top of it, one on each shoulder. His touch was not a caress. It was an anchor. It was firm, steady, and immensely solid. Through the layers of the blanket and the towel, she could feel the contained strength in his hands, the warmth of his skin. It was a touch that did not ask for anything, but only gave. It gave stillness. It gave safety. He felt the tremors that racked her body, the violent, uncontrolled shudders of a soul in panic. His hands on her shoulders were not enough. He acted on an instinct older and deeper than thought. He sat on the edge of the bunk, turned her gently, and pulled her against his chest. It was not an embrace of passion, but of refuge. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her securely, his rough jacket a coarse but comforting reality against her cheek. He held her as one might hold a person pulled from a fire, his strong arms a bulwark against the shaking, a living wall against the horrors of her mind. He said nothing, simply held her, absorbing the frantic energy of her fear into the solid mass of his own body. Slowly, slowly. The violent shaking began to subside. The rigid terror in her muscles began to soften. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against her ear, a rhythm as constant and reassuring as the turning of the earth. It was the most real thing in the world. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to grip his arms, holding on as if he were the last solid thing in a world made of water. The wind howled outside, rattling the door in its frame, but inside the cabin there was only the sound of the fire, the rain, and their breathing. When her trembling had finally eased to a mere quiver, he spoke, his voice a low rumble against her hair. "Don't be afraid," he said. "As long as I'm here, you won't be swept away again." The words went straight to the heart of her nightmare. He was not just offering comfort for the night, he was making a promise against her deepest trauma. He understood. Without her having to say a word, he understood. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and was absorbed by his jacket. It was a tear not of sorrow, but of a gratitude so profound it felt like a release. He had saved her body from the river. Now he was saving her mind from it. He held her for a long time. The storm raged outside, and the fire crackled inside. And two solitary people, a man who had walled himself off from the world and a woman the world had tried to cast out, found a quiet, unspoken understanding in a small cabin. There was no name for the bond that was forming between them. It was not love. Not yet. It was something more elemental. It was a recognition of the spirit, a mutual pact of protection and respect, forged in silence and sealed with a simple, profound act of care. When she was finally still, he eased his grip. He did not move away, but gave her space to breathe. He picked up the mug from the crate and handed it to her. Her hands were steady enough to hold it now. The coffee was black and strong, and the heat was a welcome shock to her system. They sat in a comfortable silence, side by side on the bunk, watching the flames in the stove as the storm slowly began to spend its fury. The fear had not vanished, but it had receded. It was no longer a drowning torrent, but a distant river, its roar muffled by the solid walls of the quiet cabin, and by the steady presence of the man beside her. The day after the storm was unnaturally clear, the sky washed clean and pale. The air, however, was thick with a silence that was not peaceful but expectant. Every snap of a twig, Every distant call of a bird seemed to be a prelude. Isabella and Samuel moved through the day's chores with a shared, unspoken awareness. They were waiting. The confrontation with the women had been a skirmish. The war was yet to come. Martha Caldwell's promise to return with her husband was a debt that would be paid. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and red, the waiting ended. It began as a low, rhythmic vibration in the earth, a sound felt more than heard. It grew steadily into the unmistakable drumming of many horses' hooves on the hard-packed road from town. Samuel was splitting wood by the barn, the axe rising and falling with a steady, metronomic beat. He did not break his rhythm, but his head came up, his gaze fixed on the road. Isabella, who was drawing water from the well, froze, her hand gripping the cold iron handle. The sound was not the sound of a lone rider. It was the sound of a posse. "Inside," Samuel said, his voice quiet but absolute. He did not look at her. He simply swung the axe one last time, sinking it deep into the chopping block. Isabella did not argue. She dropped the bucket, letting it clatter against the stone lip of the well, and hurried into the cool, dark interior of the adobe house. Her heart was a frantic drum, a wild counterpoint to the approaching hoofbeats. She went to the small window beside the door, peering through the thick glass. Samuel did not follow her. He walked to the porch, took down the long rifle from its pegs, and checked the action with a calm, practiced motion. He did not seem angry or afraid. He seemed resigned, a man facing an unpleasant but necessary task, like putting down a sick animal. He walked to the center of the yard, the space between the house and the road, and stood there, waiting. They came over the rise, 8 riders silhouetted against the dying sun. They looked like specters, dark figures from a fever dream. They slowed as they neared the ranch, their horses blowing and stamping in the cooling air. They did not ride in a straight line, but fanned out, forming a slow, deliberate arc that effectively sealed off the front of the property. It was a maneuver of encirclement, a physical manifestation of the town's judgment. At their head was Mayor Caldwell, his face set in a mask of grim duty. To his side was Thomas, Mary's husband, a blacksmith whose large hands looked clumsy and out of place holding the reins of his horse. The other 6 men were a collection of shopkeepers and ranchers, their faces a mixture of bravado, reluctance, and shame. They were not gunmen or vigilantes. They were husbands, sent on an errand by their wives. They came to a halt about 20 yards from where Samuel stood. The drumming of hooves ceased, replaced by the creak of leather and the jingle of harnesses. The red dust they had kicked up settled slowly, coating everything in a fine, bloody film. Mayor Caldwell cleared his throat. "Samuel," he began, his voice straining to sound official, "we have not come here for trouble." Samuel said nothing. He simply stood there, a solitary, unmoving figure, the rifle held loosely in one hand, its barrel pointed at the ground. "The town is in an uproar," the mayor continued, gesturing vaguely back toward San Marcos. "There are things a community cannot abide for the sake of peace, for the sake of order. We are asking you to hand over the woman." The words, spoken in the open air, sounded thin and absurd. Hand over the woman, like she was a stray cow or a sack of flour. "From the window!" Isabella felt a hot surge of anger that momentarily burned away her fear. Samuel still did not speak. He shifted his weight slightly and brought the rifle up, but not to his shoulder. He rested the heavy stock on his hip, the barrel angled up toward the darkening sky. It was not a threat. It was a statement. "I am armed." "Now, Samuel, listen to reason." Another man, a merchant named Henry, called out, his voice placating. "Our wives are concerned. Let us just talk to her. We'll take her back to town, to Father Donovan. It will all be handled properly." "You are on my land," Samuel said. The 2 years of his near-constant silence in town gave his voice a strange power. It was a voice they were not used to hearing, and it commanded their attention. "You have no authority here." "I am the mayor," Caldwell blustered, his authority feeling hollow even to himself. "I represent the good people of this town." "You represent your wives," Samuel replied, his voice flat, devoid of accusation. He was merely stating a fact. "You are here because you were sent, not because you believe you are right." A nervous shuffle went through the line of horses. He had struck the heart of the matter, voicing the shame that sat in the gut of every man there. They were not here for justice. They were here to appease the furies in their own kitchens. "That is enough," the mayor snapped, his face reddening. "We will have her. Carter, one way or another." He nudged his horse forward a single step. It was a challenge. The line had been drawn. Samuel shifted his stance again. He brought the rifle up and settled it on his shoulder. The worn wood familiar and solid, but he did not aim it at any one man. He pointed it at the empty space above their heads. His posture was not aggressive. It was weary. He looked at them, his gaze moving slowly from one face to the next, a deep and profound disappointment in his eyes. "You want to test what is right," he said, his voice still low, but carrying across the yard with the clarity of a bell. "Then come ahead. Take another step." The air grew taut, stretched thin as a bowstring. The challenge was laid bare. He was not challenging them to a gunfight. He was challenging them to examine the act they were about to commit, to cross his land, to take a woman from his protection. They would have to force him to shoot. They would have to turn this ugly errand into a killing. They would have to become the very thing they pretended to oppose, a lawless mob. The silence that followed was absolute. The sun had slipped below the horizon, and the world was bathed in a deep, purple twilight. The faces of the men were hard to read in the gloom. They looked at Samuel, standing alone, one man against 8, offering no threats, only a choice. And in that heavy silence, something broke. It was Thomas, the blacksmith. He had been staring at his saddle horn, his big shoulders slumped. He finally lifted his head and looked at Samuel. He had known Samuel Carter for 15 years, had shot his horses. He knew him to be a man who paid his bills, kept his word, and bothered no one. Then he looked at Mayor Caldwell, a man who measured his life in votes and compromises. "This is not right, Mayor," Thomas said, his voice a low, rough thing. The words, once spoken, seemed to gain strength. "It is not right." Caldwell turned on him, his face a mask of fury. "Hold your tongue, Thomas!" But Thomas would not be silenced. The shame he had been carrying had found its voice. "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "We all know it. This is women's gossip that has gotten out of hand. We are out here, armed, threatening a man on his own land. Over what? Because a young widow is pretty and our wives are jealous." He had said it. He had spoken the ugly, simple truth that they had all tried to bury under words like morality and peace. She should have gone back to her family in Mexico after her husband died, another man muttered, but his heart was not in it. The argument sounded weak, hollow. "Maybe so," Thomas conceded, his gaze still locked on Samuel. But she did not, and he nodded toward Samuel, pulled her from the river. He gave her shelter. "I do not see any sin in that. All I see is a man doing what he thought was right, and I, for one, am not going to draw a gun on him for it." He straightened up in his saddle. "No one ought to die for a thing like this." With that, he pulled on his reins, turning his horse's head back toward the road. He did not look at the other men. He had made his stand. His words and his action broke the spell of the mob. It was like a dam breaking. The pent-up shame and reluctance came flooding out. Another man, one of the ranchers, silently turned his horse. Then another. They avoided looking at the mayor, at each other. Their gazes were fixed on the road home, on the escape from this ugly moment. The proud arc of horses, the symbol of the town's unified judgment, dissolved into a disordered collection of individual men, each eager to be gone. Mayor Caldwell sat on his horse, his face a thundercloud of impotent rage. His posse, his authority, had evaporated into the twilight. He was left alone, facing Samuel Carter, a leader with no one left to lead. He shot Samuel a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, a look that promised this was far from over. Then he, too, yanked his horse around and galloped away, his retreat more a rout than a departure. The sound of the 8 horses faded into the night, leaving behind a silence that was deep and profound. Samuel stood in the center of the yard for a long time, the rifle still resting on his shoulder. The first stars were beginning to appear in the velvet sky. The immediate danger had passed. It had been met and turned back, not by a bullet, but by a quiet and unshakable sense of right and wrong that had found an echo in the conscience of another man. From the window, Isabella watched him. She had seen the whole thing, her hands pressed to the cold glass, her breath held tight in her chest. She had seen the terrifying arrival, the tense standoff, and the slow, unbelievable dissolution of the threat. She had seen the power in his stillness, the courage in his refusal to hate. Finally, he lowered the rifle. He turned and walked back to the house, his steps slow and weary. He mounted the porch and came inside, placing the rifle back on its pegs. He and Isabella stood in the dark room, the only light coming from the star-dusted sky outside. Their eyes met. There were no words to be said. The victory was a fragile one, and they both knew it. The men had retreated, but the source of their mission, the bitter, unyielding hatred of one woman, had not been touched. It was a fire that had been momentarily starved of fuel, but it was still burning, waiting for a new wind to blow it back into a raging inferno. The retreat of the 8 riders left a vacuum in its wake, a silence that was not peace, but the held breath before a breaking storm. In San Marcos, Martha Caldwell's humiliation was a poison that fouled the air of her own home. Her husband, the mayor, had returned in a stony silence, offering no comfort, only a quiet, damning judgment in the way he refused to meet her eyes. Thomas's public defection had been a betrayal, but her husband's silent acquiescence was a deeper wound. She had been made a fool. Her authority, her very standing as the moral compass of the town, had been shattered in a dusty ranch yard by a silent recluse, and the blacksmith she had considered a loyal foot soldier. Her rage did not cool in the night. It festered, condensed, and hardened into a single, diamond-sharp point of purpose. If the men would not act, if the town's conscience had grown soft and weak, then she would be the hand that excised the disease. She found her 2 most fervent disciples, Mary and Elizabeth, in the pre-dawn hours. Their own husbands had been part of the shameful retreat, and their shared humiliation had bound them even closer to Martha's cause. They met not in a sunlit kitchen, but in the shadows of an alley behind the mercantile, their faces pale and set in the gloom. Martha's words were not whispers of gossip now. They were the low, clear commands of a general planning a final, decisive strike. There would be no more delegations, no more appeals to a corrupted sense of justice. There would only be fire. At Samuel Carter's ranch, the night was deep and starless. A restless wind had picked up after midnight, a dry, persistent current that rattled the shutters and hissed through the eaves of the barn. It was the kind of wind that made the land thirsty, that could turn a spark into a conflagration in the blink of an eye. Inside the small adobe house, Isabella slept a dreamless, exhausted sleep. Samuel was in his own small room, the deep slumber of a man pushed to his limits. The day's tension had drained them both, leaving them vulnerable in the false peace of the night. 3 figures moved through the darkness, their dark dresses blending with the shadows. They did not take the road but cut across the open pasture, their steps silenced by the rustling of the wind in the tall, dry grass. Martha carried a tin of kerosene and an oil lamp, its wick trimmed and ready. Mary and Elizabeth carried only their shared, cold fury. They moved with the stealth of predators. Their target, the large hay barn that stood like a silent sentinel beside the main house. It was full of the winter's feed, dry as tinder, a perfect vessel for their hatred. They reached the side of the barn, pressing themselves into the deep shadows. The only sounds were the wind and the nervous lowing of a cow from within. Martha uncapped the kerosene, her movements swift and sure. She handed the can to Mary, who began soaking the dry wooden wall near the large doors. The smell of the fuel was sharp, an acrid perfume of destruction. Martha struck a match, cupping the small, precious flame against the wind. It sputtered, then caught, illuminating her face in a brief, demonic glow. Her eyes were wide, her expression one of sublime, terrible conviction. She lit the lamp. "Now," she whispered. Elizabeth, using all her strength, slid open the small hayloft door just enough to create a gap. Martha lifted the lit lamp, its flame dancing wildly in the wind. For a moment, she held it, the glass warm in her hands. This was the true purification. This was the fire that would burn away the sin, the house, the woman, the man who protected her, all of it. She swung her arm back and threw the lamp through the opening. It did not explode. It shattered with a soft crash, and for a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a hungry, percussive whoosh, the kerosene-soaked hay ignited. A bloom of orange light blossomed within the barn, visible through the cracks in the walls. A frantic, terrified bellow erupted from the cattle inside. The fire, fed by the dry hay and driven by the relentless wind, did not grow. It detonated. It blew out the hayloft opening in a roaring sheet of flame, climbing the walls, consuming the dried timbers with a terrifying speed. The night was ripped apart by a sudden, violent dawn of orange and red. Samuel was awake instantly, pulled from sleep not by a sound, but by the primal instinct that senses a mortal threat. He smelled the smoke, saw the hellish light flickering against his window. He was out of his room in a second, pulling on his boots, his mind clear and sharp. "Fire!" he yelled, his voice a raw command that sliced through the night. "Isabella, get out!" Isabella was already scrambling from her cot, her heart seizing with a terror that was somehow worse than the river. The fire was a beast, a living, roaring monster that had come to devour their sanctuary. She burst from the front door just as Samuel sprinted past, heading for the barn. The cattle, he shouted over the roar. The barn was an inferno. Flames licked from the roof, and the heat was a physical blow. A solid wall of scorching air. Inside, the panicked, screaming sounds of the trapped animals were a symphony of agony. Samuel didn't hesitate. He grabbed a wet sack he kept by the water trough, wrapped it around his head and shoulders, and charged through the main doors into the heart of the fire. Isabella stood frozen for a single, horrified second. Then the paralysis broke. The woman who had been a victim was gone, burned away by the immediacy of the crisis. She ran to the well, cranking the handle with a frantic strength, filling a bucket. It was a pitifully small weapon against such a monster, but it was something. As she worked, she saw two figures running toward them from the small line shack a quarter-mile away. It was Mateo and Jose, two Mexican hands who worked a neighboring parcel of land, drawn by the light. "Help us!" she screamed, her voice raw. "Please, help!" They did not need to be asked twice. They were men of the land. They understood the existential threat of a prairie fire. Mateo, the older of the two, grabbed an axe, while Jose joined Isabella at the well. A desperate, rhythmic chain of survival began. Pump, fill, run, throw, return. The water hissed into steam the moment it touched the burning walls. A futile gesture. Inside the barn, the heat and smoke were a vision of hell. The air was a thick, black, choking soup, shot through with embers. Samuel's eyes streamed, his lungs burned with every breath. He could barely see, navigating by memory. The cattle were wild with terror, their eyes white, crashing against the sides of their stalls. He found his knife and began slashing at the thick ropes that secured the gates, his hands burning on the hot metal. He got the first gate open, and 2 cows bolted past him, their hides smoking, and out into the night. He staggered to the next, his head swimming, his lungs screaming for air. Outside, Mateo was using the axe to smash a hole in the back wall of the barn, trying to create another escape route for the animals. Jose and Isabella worked the well, their movements a frantic, desperate dance. Isabella grabbed one of Samuel's thick wool blankets, soaked it in the trough, and ran to the side of the barn, beating at the flames that were beginning to catch on the dry grass, threatening to spread to the house. The wind was a malevolent enemy, whipping the flames into a frenzy, carrying sparks that started new, smaller fires wherever they landed. Samuel managed to cut the last rope. The remaining cattle stampeded out, a wave of terrified flesh and bone. As the last one cleared the doorway, a heavy, burning beam from the loft above crashed down, blocking the entrance. Samuel was trapped. He turned, looking for another way out, but the smoke was a black, disorienting fog. The world began to tilt, the roar of the fire fading to a dull buzz in his ears. His legs gave out, and he crumpled to the ground, the wet sack falling from his head. Isabella saw the beam fall. She saw the escape of the last cow, but she did not see Samuel. A cold dread, sharper and more terrifying than any flame, seized her. "Samuel," she screamed, her voice swallowed by the fire's roar. He did not answer. "He is still inside," she shrieked at Mateo. Mateo ran to the doorway. A wall of flame and smoke. "It is impossible," he yelled back. "No one can live in there." Isabella looked at the gaping hole Mateo had chopped in the back wall. It was small, but it was an opening. She did not think. She did not weigh the risk. She only knew that the man who had saved her was in there, the man who had anchored her in the storm, the man who was her sanctuary. She ran to the back of the barn, grabbing the soaked blanket, holding it in front of her like a shield. She scrambled through the jagged opening, into the inferno. The heat was breathtaking, the smoke a suffocating weight. She dropped to her hands and knees, where the air was clearer, her eyes streaming. "Samuel," she called, her voice a choked sob. She saw him, a dark shape on the ground, horrifyingly still. She crawled to him, the heat scorching her dress, the smoke searing her lungs. She grabbed the collar of his shirt and pulled. He was a dead weight, a mountain of a man. She dug her heels in, her muscles straining, screaming with the effort. She pulled him, inch by agonizing inch, toward the hole in the wall, away from the worst of the flames. Mateo and Jose, seeing her disappear inside, had run to the opening. They reached in, grabbing Samuel's arms, and together, the 3 of them dragged his unconscious body out into the relative safety of the night. He was not breathing. His face was covered in soot, his lips a deathly blue. Isabella fell to her knees beside him. She had seen this once. A ranch hand kicked by a horse. His breathing stopped. She had seen the doctor work on him. She did not hesitate. She tilted his head back, pinched his nose, and placed her mouth over his. She breathed into him, a single, desperate breath, then another, forcing the air from her own lungs into his. She pressed her ear to his chest. Nothing. She breathed for him again, and again, a frantic, rhythmic prayer of air and will. Suddenly, he gave a great, shuddering cough. His body convulsed, and he began to breathe on his own, shallow, ragged, smoke-filled gasps, but he was breathing. Isabella collapsed beside him, weeping with a relief so profound it was a physical pain. And then, as if in answer to a prayer she had not known she'd made, the sky opened up. A cold, hard rain began to fall. Not a drizzle, but a sudden, torrential downpour. It hissed on the burning timbers, on the hot ground, on their faces. The wind that had been their enemy now drove the rain into the heart of the fire. The roar of the flames began to lessen, subdued by the overwhelming power of the water. The fire fought back, sending up great plumes of steam, but it was a losing battle. The rain was washing it away. The rain was washing everything clean. As the fire subsided to a smoldering, steaming ruin, Matteo came to stand beside Isabella. He was staring out into the darkness, past the glow of the dying fire, toward the path the arsonists had taken. "I saw her," he said, his voice quiet but shaking with a cold anger. "When the lamp lit, just before she threw it, I was awake, by my window. I saw her face clearly in the light." It was the mayor's wife. The Sunday that followed the fire was a day of judgment. The sky was a high, indifferent blue, and a weak sun did little to warm the cold, tense air. News of the fire, and of Matteo's accusation, had swept through San Marcos like the fire itself, consuming every other topic of conversation. There was no formal lawman in the town, no judge or circuit court scheduled for months. Justice, if it was to be had, would have to be forged by the community itself, in the open, under the eye of God. By the time the morning service was supposed to start, the entire town had gathered not inside the small wooden church, but in the dusty yard before it. They formed a wide, silent circle, their Sunday clothes a strange formality against the raw, unspoken purpose of the assembly. They were not here for hymns and prayers. They were here for a reckoning. Father Donovan emerged from the church, his black cassock a stark contrast to the bright morning. He did not go to the pulpit inside, but stood on the top step of the church, the position of a man about to address his flock in a time of crisis. At one side of the step stood Isabella and Samuel. Samuel's face was still pale beneath its weathered tan, his breathing occasionally catching in a slight, rasping cough, but he stood tall, his presence a quiet, unshakable pillar of support. Isabella was beside him, her composure a thing of profound, hard-won dignity. She was not the frightened widow from the riverbank, nor the defiant woman on the porch. She was something new, a woman who had walked through fire and had not been consumed. On the other side of the yard stood Martha Caldwell, flanked by Mary and Elizabeth. Mary and Elizabeth looked pale and frightened, their eyes darting nervously around the crowd. But Martha's face was a mask of cold, unbreachable piety. She stood as if she were the one wronged, a martyr facing her accusers. Mayor Caldwell did not stand with his wife. He stood alone, near the edge of the circle, a man visibly torn between loyalties, his face a gray mask of sleeplessness and shame. Father Donovan raised his hands, and a hush fell over the assembled crowd. "My friends," he began, his voice clear and solemn, carrying to the furthest edges of the yard. "We are not a court of law. We do not have a judge robed in black or a book of statutes to guide us. We have only our conscience, our community, and our God. A great wrong has been done. A crime has been committed that threatens not just the property, but the very soul of our town. We are here today to bring the truth of that crime out of the shadows and into the light." He looked across the yard, his gaze resting for a moment on every key figure in the unfolding drama. "I will ask Matteo to come forward and speak what he saw." Matteo, dressed in clean but worn clothes, stepped into the center of the circle. He was a small man, made smaller by the intense focus of every eye in town. He stood straight, his hands clasped behind his back, and looked not at the crowd, but at Father Donovan. "Tell us what you saw, my son," the priest said gently. "The wind was strong that night," Matteo began, his voice quiet but clear, his English accented but precise. "It makes a bad sound in our small house, so I did not sleep. I was at my window, looking at the darkness. I saw figures, 3 of them. They came across the field, not from the road." He paused, taking a breath. "They went to the big barn. I saw one pour something on the wall. The smell, even from my house. I knew it later. Kerosene. Then I saw a light, a match." A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. The one with the match. She lit a lamp. Matteo continued, his voice steady. The wind was strong, so she held it close. It was a very bright light for just 1 second. Then, she held the lamp up, to throw it in the hayloft. In that moment, the flame from the lamp, it lit up her whole face. It was as clear as I see you now. Father, there is no question. It was the Signora Caldwell. A shocked murmur went through the crowd. Martha Caldwell did not flinch. She stared at Matteo with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. "He is a liar," she said, her voice sharp and ringing. "A Mexican laborer. His word against mine. He is trying to make trouble. Perhaps he set the fire himself." "I saw what I saw," Matteo said simply, turning to face her for the first time. There was no hatred in his eyes, only a quiet, sad certainty. "Is there more?" Father Donovan asked, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "Yes," Isabella said, stepping forward. Samuel placed a steadying hand on her arm for a moment, then let it fall. She held up a collection of curved, soot-stained pieces of glass in her open palm. "I found these in the ashes where the lamp fell. It is the glass from a lamp. My lamp is in the house. Samuel's lamp is in the house. This one came from outside." She then held up a piece of dark, stained fabric. "This was found caught on a nail on the side of the barn. It smells of kerosene." Martha scoffed. "A piece of glass. A scrap of cloth. That proves nothing." Father Donovan looked at her, his expression sorrowful. "Martha, the night of the fire, there were stains on the hem of your dress. Oil stains." "It was an accident in my own kitchen," she snapped. "It has nothing to do with this." The priest's gaze then moved to Mary, who stood trembling beside Martha. "Mary," he said, his voice gentle but insistent, "the day after the fire, you came to me, asking for a salve. You said you had burned your hand on your stove." Mary went white as a sheet. She instinctively hid her right hand in the folds of her skirt. "Let us see your hand. Mary," Father Donovan said. "No," Mary whispered, shrinking back. "Let us see your hand," the priest repeated, his voice gaining a quiet authority that could not be denied. Slowly, hesitantly, Mary brought out her hand. On the back of it, partially hidden by her glove, was a small, angry red blister. The unmistakable mark of a fresh burn, a burn one might get from the hot glass of a falling, shattered lamp. The sight of it broke her. A great, shuddering sob escaped her, and she collapsed to her knees in the dust, her carefully constructed composure shattering like the lamp itself. "I am sorry," she wept, her words muffled by her hands. "I am so sorry. I did not want to. Martha made us. She said it was God's will." Elizabeth, seeing her friend break, also began to cry, her silent tears a confession of her own. The circle of townspeople stood in stunned, absolute silence. The truth was laid bare, ugly and undeniable. In the center of the churchyard, Martha Caldwell stood alone, her allies having deserted her. Her face was a terrifying mask of fury and hatred. "Fools," she spat, her voice venomous, weak, sniveling fools. "It was God's will we were cleansing this town of a pestilence." Then, another figure stepped into the center of the circle. It was Mayor Caldwell. He walked past his weeping wife as if she were a stranger and stood before the priest and the town. His face was etched with a profound and public shame. "A man's first duty is to the truth," he said, his voice rough with emotion, but carrying to every corner of the yard, "and a town's first duty is to justice. For too long, I have confused my duty with a misplaced loyalty to my own house. I have been silent when I should have spoken. I have been weak when I should have been strong. For that, I ask the forgiveness of this community, and of Samuel Carter and Isabella Morales." He took a deep breath. "I cannot sit in judgment of my own wife, and this town deserves a leader whose house is in order, to ensure that justice is not only done, but is seen to be done. I hereby resign my position as mayor, effective immediately." A wave of shock went through the crowd. He held up a hand to silence them. This is not a matter for a distant court. This is a wound in our own body, and we must heal it ourselves. I propose this as a just course of action. My wife, and those who helped her, must make full restitution to Samuel Carter for the loss of his barn and his livestock. They will pay for every nail, every board, every head of cattle. He looked at the sobbing women on the ground. They will also perform a service to this community which they have so grievously harmed. For 6 months, they will work in the church, cleaning, mending, and tending to the needs of the poor, so they might learn the true meaning of Christian charity. His gaze hardened, and they will no longer hold any position of leadership in the Women's Society or any other town committee. Leadership requires moral authority, and that has been forfeited. He then turned to the other women who'd been at the river, their faces pale with guilt. There is the matter of the original sin that started all of this. Those who laid hands on Isabella Morales and cast her into the river must come forward now, before God and this community, and confess their part in that shameful act. One by one, with downcast eyes and trembling voices, the other women from that day at the river stepped forward and admitted their sin, asking for forgiveness. Each confession was a stone being removed from the invisible wall that had surrounded Isabella. Only Martha remained defiant. "I will confess nothing," she screamed, her face contorted. "I did what was right, you are all damned." But no one was listening to her anymore. The community, with its heavy, profound silence, had passed its sentence. Their eyes had shifted. When they looked at Martha, they saw not a leader, but a bitter, hateful woman who had nearly torn their town apart. And when they looked at Isabella, they no longer saw a temptress or a sinner. They saw a woman of quiet strength and unshakable dignity. The invisible verdict had been reversed. As Mayor Caldwell finished speaking, a new sound filled the air, a sound no one had heard in over 7 months. It was the deep, resonant tolling of the church bell. Father Donovan had instructed the sexton to ring it. It rang out over the silent yard, a clear, powerful tone that washed over the town. It was not a call to worship or a mourning of the dead. It was a proclamation. The long silence was over. A moral order, broken and nearly destroyed, was being restored. The bell rang for justice, for truth, and for the chance of a new beginning. The winter that followed the public hearing was long and quiet, a time for the raw wounds of the town to scar over. The ashes of the old barn were cleared away, the scorched earth left to the healing grace of the cold rains. In San Marcos, the penance of the guilty women became a part of the town's weekly rhythm. They were seen on their knees, scrubbing the church floors, their fine dresses replaced with plain, serviceable frocks. Their former followers avoided their eyes. Martha Caldwell worked with a silent, simmering fury, her pride unbent, but she was isolated, a queen without a court. The town, having looked into the abyss of its own making, had pulled back, choosing the quiet, difficult work of rebuilding its own soul. Then, spring returned to the Texas Hill Country. It came not as a sudden event, but as a slow, gentle persuasion. The Guadalupe River, once a brown and churning monster, now ran clear and serene between its greening banks, along the water's edge, where the mud had been thick and greedy. Patches of yellow and blue wildflowers began to appear, their colors a testament to the stubborn resilience of life. The change in the season was mirrored in the life of Isabella Morales. She did not receive a formal apology from every person in town. She did not need one. What she received was something far more valuable, the simple, unspoken right to exist. When she walked into the general store, the conversations no longer stopped. The storekeeper's wife would smile and ask about her small garden. Thomas, the blacksmith, would tip his hat to her from across the street, a gesture of profound, quiet respect. The whispers that had once followed her like a shadow had been replaced by a neutral, and in some corners, a warm acceptance. She had begun to take the wagon into town by herself on occasion, a small act of independence that felt like a monumental victory. She sold the herbs from her garden and the extra eggs from her small flock of chickens. She bought flour and sugar, and the adobe house was often filled with the warm, comforting smell of her baking. The fear had not vanished entirely, but it had receded into a distant memory, a scar that no longer ached with every step. Her dignity, which she had fought so hard to protect, was no longer a contested territory. It was simply hers. At the ranch, a new rhythm had taken hold, one of quiet partnership. Samuel, with the restitution money and his own tireless labor, had begun constructing a new, smaller barn. They often worked in a comfortable silence, their movements a practiced dance. She would bring him a dipper of cool water from the well as he worked under the warm sun. He, in turn, would leave a freshly picked handful of wild berries on the porch rail for her. His face, which had been a mask of stoic solitude, had softened. He had begun to smile, not often with his mouth, but with his eyes. It was a subtle shift, a crinkling at the corners that spoke of a contentment he had not known for many years. One afternoon, in the full bloom of spring, Samuel drove the final post for the new fence line into the ground. It was the last piece of the ranch to be mended, the final boundary to be secured. He stood back, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and looked at the long, unbroken line of the fence stretching across the pasture. It was more than just wood and wire. It was a physical manifestation of his promise, a declaration to the world that this small piece of land was a place of safety. The fence was complete. The sanctuary was whole. Later that day, as the afternoon sun began to slant, casting long, golden shadows across the land, he found Isabella sitting on the porch, mending one of his shirts. He simply stood before her for a moment, then gave a slight nod toward the river. "Let us walk," he said. She put down her sewing, a small smile touching her lips, and they walked together, not toward the town, but down the long, gentle slope of the pasture, toward the Guadalupe. The air was warm and smelled of damp earth and blooming flowers. They did not speak, but their shoulders brushed occasionally, a simple, comforting point of contact. They came to the spot where it had all begun. It was almost unrecognizable. The steep, muddy bank had grassed over, and a profusion of tiny yellow flowers grew in a thick carpet right to the water's edge. The river itself was a peaceful, slow-moving ribbon of green and silver, reflecting the endless blue of the sky. The monster was gone, and in its place was a thing of beauty. Isabella knelt down and picked a single, perfect yellow wildflower. She held it in her fingers for a long moment, looking at its delicate petals. Then, she leaned over the water and gently placed it on the surface. It did not sink. The current caught it, a gentle, barely perceptible tug, and began to carry it downstream. They watched as it floated away, a small, bright speck of gold on the green water, until it rounded a bend and disappeared from sight. It was a farewell, a burial of the past, a quiet, personal absolution. Samuel stood beside her, his presence a silent, unwavering testament. He understood what she was doing, what she was letting go of. He had not offered her words of comfort. He had offered her the safety and the time to find her own peace. They turned and walked back toward the house as the sun dipped lower, painting the clouds in shades of rose and lavender. They still had not given a name to what existed between them. The words of romance and courtship belonged to a different world, a world of parlors and poems. Their world was one of sun and soil, of work and survival. In the West, love was not a declaration. It was a promise kept through action. It was the silent understanding that tomorrow you would both rise before the sun. It was the shared knowledge that the cattle needed watering, the fences needed checking, the garden needed tending. It was a commitment not to a feeling, but to a shared life, a shared future. They did not need to speak of marriage or vows. Their vows were in the foundation of the new barn. in the neat rows of Isabella's garden, in the solid, finished line of the fence. Their love was in the cup of coffee he brought her in the quiet of the morning, and in the neatly mended shirt she left for him in the evening. They reached the crest of the hill and stopped, looking at their home, the small adobe house, bathed in the soft, golden light of dusk, looked rooted to the earth, a place of profound and enduring peace. A few chickens scratched in the dust near the porch. The world was quiet. The only sounds, the lowing of a distant cow and the first chirps of the evening crickets. Samuel looked at Isabella, the last light of the day catching in her dark hair, and the smile in his eyes was as warm and as bright as the spring sun. She smiled back, a full, genuine smile of a woman who was finally, truly home. Their future was not a grand, mapped-out thing. It was as simple and as profound as the promise of the next sunrise, a safe roof over their heads, the sound of chickens in the early morning, and the quiet, comforting presence of each other. They stood together, watching the last of the light fade, and on the dry, welcoming earth, their two long shadows stretched out and became one. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are listening from in the comments below so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story and video can be heard by more people.